Well, hi there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Learn Live UAE with myself, Mark Anderson, and my co-host, Mr. Ollie Lewis, _coaching. That's how we introduce ourselves to people when we meet them actually for real, isn't it? I'm like, hi, I'm the evangelist here. No, not really. But no, welcome to the show, everybody. I'm really excited, as I know Ollie is as well, to have some fantastic guests on the show this evening. I'm just going to do this. So I don't want to hide things exactly, but Ollie's showing the actual the name of the book on the side. This is a book written by Kate McAllister and Dr. James Mannion, which is Fear is the Mind Killer. And I'm really pleased to have both James and Kate on the show this evening to discuss some of the things that are inside the book and to talk about other things all around education. One of the great things about the show, though, is that, as always, we are able to engage really well with you, our viewers. So if you've got any questions about the book and the things that are held within there, then please do pop those things into the chat. And as always, it's lovely to hear from you anyway. We hope you're having a great week. Many of us are on half term, so let's be kicking back. And it may well be that the busiest thing on your mind right now is what's going to go on top of your pancakes tomorrow, if that's something that you're into. But if not, please do stick around, say hello in the chat, ask your questions, and we're looking to learn more about learning to learn, in air quotes, from James and Kate, based upon what is, to me, a really well-grounded book, but also full of lots of practical takeaways. As you'll see in one of my questions later on, there's a lot of, what does this look like in practice sections running throughout the book. And that's, for me, with my teacher hat on, is so helpful. And when it comes to translating the ideas being shared in any book to what it might look like for you actually in the classroom. So welcome to the show. That's our focus and topic for the show this week. And just want to ask you, Ollie, how are you doing?
Really good. I'm on half term. I know that not everybody in the Middle East can say that. It's only British curriculum schools. So I take my hat off to all of the other curriculums that are still forging on, the local schools, the Indian curriculum schools, the American curriculum schools. I hope you guys are all well. Obviously, you haven't had a break. You're still forging on, but you will have had students in your rooms, in your classrooms, face-to-face for the first time in 2021, which is a massive thing, thing. And especially for those students in year 7, 8, 9 that may not necessarily, certainly in the Emirate of Abu Dhabi, not actually set foot in the building this academic year, not just this calendar year, but this academic year. So yeah, I'm very well. Looking forward to next week when we have students back in. What have I been doing for my own well-being? I guess is probably a question that you might ask me, Mark, given that it's half term. A little bit of reading. Drove out today. I made that cardinal error where you don't check the opening hours of somewhere, and we all hopped in the car, drove down to the nature reserve where the flamingos are to find that it was shut. So it was all good fun though. We ended up just playing in the dust. It was just nice to be outside, get a bit of fresh air in. So yeah, very much enjoying a little bit of a break, Mark.
It's interesting you mentioned the well-being word as well. We were both exceedingly busy with things last week, and so we didn't have a show last week, which again I think is important for us to not just talk the talk on these sort of things, but walk the walk as well. So that sort of just explains that away a little bit, because as I say, sometimes things are too busy and we can't always run the show, which I think is fair enough on occasion. Big shout out to Mr. Al Kingsley Edu joining us, and a long time supporter of the show as well. Thanks for joining us, Al. Hope you're having a good day over there in Peterborough. And I think it's about time now, though, we brought our guests on, because they're going to think it's just like the Mark and Ollie show, and they just catch up and then they get 2 minutes on air. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. James Mannion. Welcome, James. And Kate McAllister.
Nice to meet you all.
Welcome, Kate. Thank you. Welcome, James. Jumping straight into the questions, if that's all right, because I want people to sort of get to know you and who you are and these sorts of things. So the first question is a really easy one, really. Could you share a little bit about yourselves and your career to date? And I'll start with you, Kate, if that's okay, and then jump to you, James, to follow on, please.
Sure. So before I was a teacher, I worked in advertising, and I was also a bilingual legal secretary for a little while. And then I moved into teaching when my son was small, and I taught in secondary schools in the UK for around 15 years. And that's when I became very interested in learning to learn, in how to make learning work better for young people who found it difficult, and how to make it work better for kids who didn't find it difficult, kind of how to make it work better for everybody, really. And so that led me to working with James. And then when I left school, I moved into working in emergency education. And that's through refugee camps across Europe. And now, as you can see behind me, I'm in the Caribbean. So I've opened a school here. So that's the last 20 years in a nutshell.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for sharing that, Kate. James, a little bit about yourself and your career as well, please.
Yeah, sure. So it doesn't end in the Caribbean, unfortunately, my story, or at least not yet. I used to be a scientist, and I worked in neuroscience and various scientific realms before I became a teacher, then became a science teacher. And I used to find that I was quite frustrated, a little bit like Kate, but in a different way, that I just couldn't reach some kids. If you're talking about electromagnets or about how a nuclear power station works or something, there are just some kids that you can't really begin to have a conversation with about that. They just seem to be like, they're not interested in this. And so I sort of got into PSHE quite early on, because I found that when you're talking about things that they've got some sort of like a moral dimension, kids really become animated. So talking about things like bullying or animal rights, whatever it is, and all of a sudden these kids who wouldn't speak to you previously come to life. And I was like, oh, I'm much more interested in teaching people than I am in teaching science. And I think that we need both of those sort of mindsets in the teaching profession, people who are really into their subject, but also people who are really into like human development, if you like. And so when Learning to Learn came knocking, and Kate was brought into my school to set up a Learning to Learn curriculum, and I met her in the interview room, and to my delight, she appointed me to be part of her team. And I could see that this was something that was going to be really fruitful. So that was how come we came to know one another. And the last 10 years, I did a PhD, an 8-year PhD, which was studying the impact of this Learning to Learn intervention that we designed and taught, which, came to fruition in that book that you were just waving around very kindly. And now I work at the Institute of Education. Thank you, Ollie. Now work at the IOE, part of UCL, for 2 days a week. And I am an independent consultant on the side.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. Ollie, over to your next question.
Before I delve into that, I'm a bit enthralled. You both had such an interesting career to date so far, with all the different things that you've done. I'd love to do another show just picking your brains on all of those different experiences you've had. Our first question then, delving sort of into the book then, is from the outset, you talk about the disparity of learning to learn as a concept, where compared to some aspects of education, such as direct instruction, what differs from ideas that you share to those that we often seen shared on social media platforms?
Yeah, this whole thing sort of came about 10 years too late in some sense, in that, 10 or 15 years ago, Learning to Learn was all the rage, and there was lots of schools who were implementing learning to learn curricula. Some of them went really well and some of them not so much. And so it's taken us this long. We never lost the faith, as it were. But in the last 10 years, there's been I'm sure that this is the case globally, but certainly in the English education system, there's been this really hard swing away from the skills agenda, which was really strongly promoted under the New Labour administration. Even the Department for Education was called the DFES for a while, the Department for Education and Skills. So skills was like absolutely central to their thinking. And some of that thinking was quite woolly, right? Like people with like the PLTS, if you remember, the personal learning and thinking skills framework, which was presented as a set of generic skills that can be taught in the abstract, that you can develop these in the absence of sort of subject knowledge. So there's some pretty flaky thinking going on. And since then, partly inspired by, a frustration that grew out of things like that, we've swung hard the other way, where, and it's partly informed by cognitive science, where cognitive scientists are saying, knowledge is really important here. You need to know stuff if you want to think critically or creatively. And that's sort of where we're at in terms of the wider education debate. Things have gone hard in the direction of a traditional pedagogy and a traditional approach to curriculum. And we're sort of, talking about something that it doesn't go against that at all. It's not an anti-knowledge thing, but it's like, it definitely goes, what we're talking about goes against the grain of the vast majority of what we see in all of these books that are being published around retrieval practice and Rosenshine's principles of instruction and cognitive load theory. And we're not banging that drum. We're talking about something that actually really complements a knowledge-rich curriculum. But it definitely is about something that's wider than that. And I think that just to share an idea of Guy Claxton's, which I think illustrates the difference between what we're doing and what the knowledge-rich traditionalists are doing. Claxton uses this metaphor of a river of learning, and there's 3 different layers of current, if you like. And on the surface, there are little rafts with little packets of knowledge on, translate this sentence, balance this equation, whatever it is, little bits of knowledge. And that stuff goes quite quickly, right? That's the stuff that we do retrieval practice about. And then the layer beneath that, you've got skills, right? So you've got sort of like the skills that underpin your ability to balance an equation or your ability to translate, Spanish sentence or whatever it might be. And that current moves a little bit slower. The development of skills is sort of a little bit slower than just these little bits of knowledge. And then at the bottom of the river is character, is dispositions, right? And so, for example, if you like leap in to help a kid, as soon as they ask a question and like, what page is it, even though you've written it on the board and told them 5 times, if you just tell them that answer, then you're developing a character trait of dependency. Like they're going to be like, if I get stuck, I'm going to ask a miss or so is just going to help me out. And so they're not going to sort of grow those independent learning legs, if you like. And so I'm really interested, and Kate is as well, I think, developing all 3 of these layers, but especially this stuff at the bottom, because I think that's going to set kids up for a life of learning beyond the school gates, where there isn't going to be a teacher to tell you what to do and when and how.
That massively resonates with me, James. I used to work with a guy called Jim Smith, who wrote the Lazy Teacher's Handbook. Yeah. And one of the things, learn helplessness. I'm a secondary teacher by trade as well. And in my experience, so many children come through from primary having learned that helplessness along the way because it's been reinforced by that immediate fix you're talking about there with that support. And I remember distinctly him saying, having these little phrases that he would share with students, where the student says, I don't know the answer, or I don't know how to do it. Or well, what if I gave you £1 million to know the answer? What would you do then? What would you do instead? And trying to draw out those strategies from the students themselves. So that they're able to do those sort of things. Do you see, James? I've not taught for 6 years in classroom myself anymore. Do you still see this sort of learned helplessness? And say the same question to both you and to Kate, perhaps. If you could respond to that, do you still see that sort of thing happening a lot in schools?
I'll go if you like, and then Kate. So Jim's book, The Lazy Teacher's Handbook, was quite influential to me around this time when, as a science teacher, I really found that those questions that he suggested were really helpful. I also am not in the classroom currently. But just to illustrate, I think we include this at the start of the book. We asked a question on Twitter recently, which was like, what are the helpless kinds of questions that kids ask you? And we often don't get much response to our tweets, but we were absolutely inundated with like hundreds of responses. And people were saying that it's not even questions. They just sort of say things like, my pencil is broken when it just needs sharpening, or like, what should I do with the rubbish? Or like, I've done question 1, what should I do now? And there was no shortage of this. And so it's endemic. And in the work that Kate and I do with teachers, we often ask this question, what's the one thing that you would most like to change? And it's nearly always a variation on this theme of like, the kids are just really needy. I feel like I'm just weighed down with all these sort of like minute little questions. And those questions are always about process. They're never about learning. It's always about, what should I do with X, Y, or Z? should I underline the date, that sort of thing. And it's just like, if we can remove that burden from the classroom and from the teachers, then we can unleash all kinds of cool things in its place. So yeah, it's very widespread in my experience.
I mean, one of the quotes I remember distinctly from the book is where one person sort of shared about whether the teacher could fold a page for them. I mean, like, it's just crazy, some of the things that children ask you to do. Well, what are your thoughts, Kate? I'm sort of keen to bring you in.
I am in the classroom again, across a mixed age of mixed ages from 4 to 14. Mixed cultures, languages, backgrounds, to see the difference in the way they give themselves permission or wait for permission to come from somebody else to go and do something that they need in order to do the task that they want to achieve. And I'm watching how it changes as they get older. So the longer they are in formal education, the less they give themselves permission to go and sharpen a pencil when it needs sharpening. They're waiting to ask for that permission to be granted to them all of the time. They're perfectly capable of sharpening a pencil. And yet they're not doing it without permission. So it's really interesting to see how long it takes for them to believe that they actually can do it. They're allowed to go and do the thing that they need to do to carry on with their work. So this helplessness is... part of it becomes habitual. They just become used to not doing things until they're told how to or told that they can. And the natural talent and thinking is there. It's just we seem to get rid of it. There's something that we do in schools by not allowing them the autonomy to move around by themselves, because it creates chaos in the beginning until they learn how to just do it quietly and unobtrusively. And I've watched it now, so I'm on with them. And the first week was just questions nonstop. Can I have this? Can I do that? Can I do this? And you're pulling that face, going, really? You're asking me that? People are just they're moving around the place. They're getting what they need to do. I've been able to step out of school today to come and talk to you guys. And I looked around before I left, and everybody's on task, and they know what they're doing, and they've written down their task lists, and they're good. So in 5 weeks, you can get from not leaving a room to sharpen a pencil when you know that you need to being able to manage your day entirely. So we just have to give the space, the time, and the permission for that to happen. And when we do, it's amazing.
It's really interesting. I'm in the process at school of interviewing for teachers in my team, and a question that I always ask scientists, I'm a science teacher by trade, is which is more important in our science curriculum, knowledge or skills? And 9 out of 10 people always say skills, because that's something that's massively important to us as science teachers. Very few people ever go for knowledge. This brings in then a question from one of our viewers, Al Kingsley. Have we got the right balance in the UK? Have we swung too far and skills focus is too limited now?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to pick that one up if you like. Thank you for the question, Al. I do think that that there is a need for a new synthesis. We seem to be endlessly swinging back and forth between progressive and traditional ideas, and it's very clear that we need a new synthesis. And I think that the version of learning skills curriculum that we outline in the book is a version of what that new synthesis could look like, where we need to integrate these, like knowledge or skills. It's just such a silly question, because it's a boring question almost. Like the most interesting question is, how do they connect? What and how do they interact, and what comes first? That's a really interesting question. What comes first, knowledge or skills? And actually, it's a sort of reciprocal relationship. You sort of need to know some stuff in order to be able to develop skills, but then those skills enable you to develop further knowledge and so on, and it iterates onwards. So, yeah, I mean, in terms of a balance, I don't think that the balance is there currently. I think that we're banging the knowledge drum hard, and knowledge is necessary. It's absolutely necessary, but it is not sufficient to set people up for a life of independent, effective learning, especially in this world of propaganda and lies and misinformation and disinformation and fake news. Like a knowledge-rich curriculum in traditional subjects, yes, it's important, but that is not enough to prepare people for this world. And you can see that because the world is full of, COVID deniers and QAnon conspiracy theorists. And all those people sat in, geography lessons and history lessons and maths and French and art lessons. And it has not prepared them for a world where they're able to see through the nonsense that the world is, that the internet and parts of the mainstream media are, awash with. So, yes, thanks for the question, Al. And I think that we do need to address a point of balance. That's what we need. Balance is a good question.
Great, thank you very much for the question, Al, and thank you to James for your response there. Just to hand this next question over to Kate, please. There's currently a narrative in certain areas of the world, certainly here in the UK, this is something which is coming up and being discussed quite a lot about sort of lost learning and a catch-up curriculum and closing the gap and all of this. I mean, there are some that say actually the pandemic has provided opportunities for students to learn things that they wouldn't have otherwise had the opportunity to learn. I know from my own children that they've actually had to be far more resilient. Just seeing how they learn from home and that learned helplessness again, expecting me as their dad to, do X, Y, and Z. And you know where the printer is, go and collect it. Why should I have to print something from your device you're on right now that you could then go upstairs and collect for yourself? And it's just simple things like that again. But coming to you first, Kate, please. Where do you stand on this idea of like a catch-up curriculum and closing the gap? And following on from that, what do you think schools should be doing in relation to this? Do you think it should be perhaps sort of recognising it hasn't been lost learning, it's been different learning, or I don't know. What do you think?
I think catching up is troublesome. We set the bar, we decide where the curriculum should be. It's completely arbitrary. And therefore, if we want to change the bar because the whole world has changed, we can just move it and we can remove the gap if we choose to and say we're going to learn different things and those things are not going to be on the exams in 5 years' time. We've decided to change it. And therefore, we just remove the pressure. It's just gone and we don't need to have it anymore. So this fear and panic that's being spread through parents, which is then being picked up with their children, that somehow they're going to suffer for the rest of their lives because they're missing out on learning, is, I think, irresponsible and totally unnecessary. So that's how I feel about this narrative of lost learning and closing gaps. If we choose to close it, we can just close it. And because learning doesn't stop at 16 or 18, it carries on for the rest. So if there's a small piece that we missed during the pandemic, we can learn it probably in 2 weeks. As adults, if we find that we need it for college or if we need it for a job or if we need it for our personal interest, we go, oh, I didn't learn that in school. Maybe that was during the pandemic. Fine, I'll look it up on YouTube or I'll go and do a course or I'll find a teacher. If you are able to meet your own learning needs, which is what the learning skills curriculum helps people to do, you can plug your own gaps. We don't have to make all children sit in classrooms for an extra 2 hours a day to try and catch up on something. I really don't think that that's the best use of time. My personal feeling is that spending that time on building relationships that have been lost, on building a sense of internal safety, on building confidence back, is going to be far better spent in the long run. It's going to improve physical health. It's going to improve emotional health. It's going to improve children's ability to learn by themselves and with others. I think that's the biggest investment that we can make now, is to give them some time to get back to feeling normal again, to feeling confident and enthusiastic about learning, not terrified that they've got behind and that they're going to be behind forever. That never helps anybody to move forward.
Mm. No, I completely agree with what you're sharing there, Kate. Thank you for your perspectives there. You've got someone just behind you as well. I don't know if you can spot them there behind you, Kate, over your show. That's live for you. At least we haven't all got hats sort of filters on our face all the way through. Ollie, did you want to jump on to the next question for our guests?
Sure. Yeah, this one's for James initially. What would you suggest in terms of strategies then for schools in terms of implementing learning to learn and then scaling it up across a school?
Your mic's off. Sorry, James.
Sorry, I knew that would happen. Thank you. I'm going to try to rein myself in here because I get quite animated when I talk about implementation science. So if feel free to cut me off if I just start foaming at the mouth. So implementation is really, really key. At the moment, I'm working with a school to help them to implement a learning skills curriculum that's very closely modeled on the one that's in the book. And essentially, there's 3 components that I'm working with them on. Number one, to start by appointing a dedicated team of teachers like we had, because this thing needs curriculum time. There's been this debate that's raged since the sort of 70s, really, as to whether or not you can teach these sort of skills and dispositions and habits in a discrete lesson, or whether it should be infused across the piece. And for some reason, people have often just taken one or other of those views. And actually, the research suggests that neither of those approaches is sufficient. You need to do both. You need to have taught lessons, and you need to have stuff like this embedded across the piece so that children are experiencing a more joined up diet of learning. And you need strategies to promote the transfer out of the classroom, the learning skills classroom, and into subject learning across the curriculum. And so, first of all, we work with a dedicated team of teachers, and they need to be interviewed, and there should be a selective process, because sometimes in the past, this has been given to people they're referred to in the literature as skeptical conscripts, people who've just been sort of kicked up the backside and told to get in there and do it because they have a bit of time on their timetable. And if you do that, it won't work. You might as well not bother. So have a dedicated team of teachers. Have some whole school elements. So I'm working with them on a whole school basis, so that there is this joined up diet of learning, and there's things like a shared language of learning, and they all use the same sort of talk rules. So when we're setting up a group task or a discussion task in pairs, that they're talking about dialogue in the same way, so that we're working towards, for example, exploratory talk. And the third element, which is something that I've only come to quite recently, is to work with something called a vertical slice implementation team. And this is different to the usual top-down model of change, because change in schools is usually led by senior leaders, isn't it, or the head teacher. And if you ask a teacher, what happens typically when some change gets rolled out, they usually, their shoulders go down, they roll their eyes, they tut or they huff, and they're like, it just dissipates, it disappears within a year or two. And either because that senior leader's job role changed, or because they moved to a different school, whatever it might be, or they were just doing it for their, for a project for their senior leadership qualification. And so what we do instead is to have a vertical slice. So you work with a team of teachers, like a slice through the organization. So there's the senior leader, middle leader, a newly qualified teacher, a teacher who's been teaching for, 20 or 30 years or more, the Senko, teaching assistants, LSAs, whoever it might be, who's got something to say about this. And you get them all sitting around a table together. And around that table, although the name vertical slice implies that there's a hierarchy in the organization, of course there always is, but around that implementation table, they are equally responsible. They're equals. They're equally responsible for writing an implementation plan for how to make this thing really work over 3 to 5 years, because that's how long it takes change to happen. And then to executing that plan over time. It's probably going to be overseen by 1 or 2 senior leaders, but when you have this sort of hive mind structure in place, if you like, then regardless of the changes in personnel that are inevitable over a 3 to 5 year period, the change mechanism, if you like, remains intact. And so that's something that I've been doing lots of work on recently, and I'm about to release an online course in the next couple of months to really try to scale up this approach, this implementation science toolkit that I've put together, because it seems to be something that's much more widely applicable than just learning to learn. Even it is applicable to any change that you want to roll out in schools. So yeah, just to reiterate those three things: work with a dedicated team, work with the whole staff to make sure that there's joined up stuff happening, and work with one of these vertical slice implementation teams.
That's a great answer, James. Thank you very much. And also I want to hear from Kate as well. But it sounds really similar to what I do with schools around digital strategy and implementation of technology. And so you work with the stakeholders, you work with people throughout the organisation. It's not about one big sort of silver bullet trying to do anything, but looking at aggregated gains and how you can embed it and all those different things. Seems to be lots of parity. And as you said, actually, it's not necessarily about learning to learn. These are sort of practices and strategies you could actually adopt to, as Jim would call it, GCSE pigeon studies. Whatever it is you're trying to sort of do, sort of cultural or whatever you're trying to bring in, can apply around that as well. Kate, just want to bring you in so you can respond to the question. What were your thoughts, Kate?
On how to scale up learning to learn?
Yeah.
Sorry, because you wander in and out of my hearing here, I'm afraid.
That's okay.
I'd just like to, I suppose, really pick up on what James was saying, that you need to have a team of people who want to be doing this. I'm doing this right now. I've just opened a whole school, and so I'm setting up my vertical slices now, and I've got children involved too, and I've got parents in there, and we've got 3 vertical slices of our 3 main values that we want to bring forward to make sure that we never go too far away from our core purpose. And it's fascinating and it's working really well. And what's interesting is getting that balance between what's tight and what's loose. So when you start, you need to leave space for things, for people to step into the gap. What we tend to do, I think, as managers and as teachers, is we're frightened of too much open space. We're frightened of too much dead time. And so we fill it and we try to control. And we try to control the children in our class, which is how we end up removing permission from them. We take control of every decision that they make so that there's not too much that's loose. And in management, to save time, we control all the decisions that our teachers to make. So in order for something like this to work, if you want truly self-regulating children in your classrooms who can be independent and make decisions that they can stand by and be proud of and that get them to where they want to go, they've got to be taught by teachers who know how to do that themselves. So part of this implementation is the adults have to grow too. They have to grow into their role as decision makers. They have to grow into their role as people who take responsibility and who work together in order that they can provide that space and hold it long enough for the children to grow into it too. So it's more than just a tick list. There's a real personal transformation that happens when you start to work in this way as a team. And when you can talk about that honestly and say, well, this bit I loved and I stepped into it and it was great, and this bit, oh, it was really uncomfortable and I didn't enjoy it and I found it really hard, then you can have those conversations with the children and say, yeah, I know this is hard. It was hard for me when I was having to learn how to do this too. And then it becomes something honest that you share. And then it's real. Then it really works. I think that's the difference between it conceptually and practically, is when you've lived through the experience of growing in that way and been given that permission to design something that works for you, then it really works for you. That's kind of the answer.
That's a great addition there, across both of your responses. I think it's really important that it's organic within your organisation, and the people that are leading it want to drive it. One of our favourite parts in the book is where, and you say it, both of you throughout it, is what does this actually look like in practice? And with that in mind, what do you both wish was in the book which isn't? And can we come to Kate on that first, please?
Oh gosh, that's a big book already. And when we started to write it, it could have been like this big. So almost another whole book came out. And maybe eventually we'll write more books. There's so much that I wish that we had measured. We measured the impact on learning of the youngsters. That's what we measured properly. That's what James measured, not me. James did it for his PhD. But I wish that we'd also measured the impact on the teachers, on how empowered we became as educators, how much stronger in our practice and in our skills to network and work together. I wish that we had the impact of that we could show, because our lives have all changed enormously since we worked together doing this. I wish that we had understood more about self-regulation and the science of the nervous system. When we started working on it, we were working intuitively. I think that I understood attunement on in an intuitive way, not much in a scientific way. And I wish now that we had I wish I knew then what I know now, and I would train all teachers in the practice of self-regulation so that they could more effectively co-regulate with their students. And I wish that we had a whole section to do that in the book. Gosh, I wish there's so much more that was in that program that we didn't measure highly. But I guess that's why I'm excited for other schools to step forward and say, we think we would like to do something like that. And then we would be able to support them in saying, we've got a system for measuring that now, and we've got a system for measuring this, and they would be able to collect that data and get a much richer picture, because learning was just one small part of the magic of this learning skills curriculum. There was so much more to it than just exam results. But we had to write a book about one thing, and that's the thing that we wrote it about.
That's sometimes the issue, isn't it? You know, there are so many things you want to include. It can be quite debilitating, actually, can't it? When you've got so much you actually want to cover and include, and then when you sort of think about the volume of, when you extrapolate it out as to how many chapters that might be, it's like we did a few minutes ago, Kate, with James's answer. It's squeeze it down a little bit. Jumping back to you for a second, James, thinking about the chapters. Chapter 5 explores and talks about the components of complex intervention. What do you mean by complex intervention, and how does that work in practice?
Yeah, thank you for drawing this out. So, as I mentioned earlier, I used to work as a scientist before I became a teacher. And in science, this idea of a complex intervention is really widespread. It's something that's very common. And just to give you one example, in medicine, so there's this idea of multimodal analgesia. So like when somebody has an operation, it's painful, right? They've been under the scalpel. And so usually they give you just morphine. It's like the standard thing to give somebody for post-operative pain is morphine. But morphine's got loads of horrible side effects. It's really groggy and it makes you nauseous, and there's like headaches, and there's all these horrible side effects. And so what they found was if you use what they refer to as multimodal analgesia, so you give somebody preemptive analgesia, so you give them analgesia at the local site of this, so local anesthetic at the site of the injury where it's going to happen. And you can also regulate pain at the level of the spinal cord and also, you know, in the brain. And you know, you give them a massage, and, you know, there's all these different methods that you can use. Using heat and cold and so electro whatever stimulation, all these different methods that don't really cost very much, and lo and behold, you get better pain relief, and the patient is out of bed quicker, so the hospital turns over beds quicker, and it's like a win-win-win-win-win. It saves money and everyone benefits. And this thinking is widespread in healthcare, in psychotherapy, and in social work, and in other fields. And in education, it's almost completely missing. Like if you look at the Education Endowment Foundation in the UK, have got this roster of, like, you know, now over 200 randomized controlled trials that they've run over the last 10 years or so. And in nearly every case, they're looking at a single variable intervention. It's like one of them is about daily singing. One of them is about sending text messages home to parents. And it's like, is this the silver bullet? Or is it, if we do phonics, is that the silver bullet? Or is it if we get the kids to come in on a Saturday morning, is that the silver bullet? And it's just madness, because it's like, well, what if it's a combination of 5 or 10 of these things? So the idea of when we came to, you know, to start thinking about putting this curriculum together, I immediately thought, well, this is a complex intervention. And like you said earlier, aggregated gains or marginal gains theory, the idea that you put stuff in, each of which is a good idea, and you get some small bump in the right direction. But if you only measure that versus the control group, you probably won't see any difference. But if you stack up these 10 different elements and they all sort of interact, you get this bigger effect size overall. And so that was what we did. We created a complex intervention which had many moving parts. So we, like in the taught curriculum, there was project-based learning was a big part of what we did. And there's lots of mini elements within that. Philosophy for children was a big part of what we did. Oracy, so presentational talks, structured debates. We had them meditating. We had them writing in learning journals. We were doing weekly reviews. The list goes on and on and on. But fundamentally, it boils down to 3 ideas that interact in theory and in practice. Metacognition being the first one. So finding ways, and we do find that as monitoring and controlling your thought processes. So what's going on in your head. Secondly, self-regulation, which is monitoring and controlling your feelings and behaviors. So they're kind of like mirror images, if you like. Metacognition is what's going on in your head, and self-regulation is monitoring and controlling what's going on in your body. So that could be physical feelings or emotional feelings, and also how you interact. And it's all about how you interact with the external environment. So that's the second one. And the third key element was oracy. As I mentioned earlier, we absolutely threw the kitchen sink at oracy and helping these kids to develop. And that was so instrumental in helping them develop confidence. And lots of them said that the reason that learning to learn lessons were like helped them to learn more effectively in their other subjects was because they felt more confident, and they'd found their voice, physically found their voice, but also metaphorically found their voice, and they were able to take their place in the world, if you like. So yeah, that's our complex intervention. And we don't recommend that teachers take our one off the shelf. Like this is some sort of surefire recipe for success. Like you were saying earlier, Ollie, everybody's got to sort of create their own complex intervention that's bespoke to their particular teachers, for their particular kids at this particular point in time.
Thanks, James. I mean, that to me talks about the importance of being mindful of context, because every school's different, every child's different. You know, I remember one year I had like 5 different year 7 classes, you know, which all the same subject, but any of those lessons were never ever the same. Just from the nature of the makeup of different characters, different times of the day. There are so many variables which you can interact in that. But does it not sort of link back to that idea from Hattie about collective teacher efficacy, when you're all working together and following similar approaches? Is that the sort of thing you're alluding to there? Is a similar thing when we're talking about these complex interventions?
I've not come across this idea of collective teacher efficacy. Could you break that down?
Yeah, of course I can. Yeah, so you're aware of John Hattie in his work and his research and what have you, and the various sorts of impacts that different strategies can have. From the top ones tend to be things you're sharing about self-regulation, metacognition, all the rest of it. But one of the sort of things which I think is slightly higher than the metacognition is this idea of collective teacher efficacy, when an organisation, a school organisation, is working well together with similar goals in consistent ways. These sorts of things, then you have more impact on student progress and learning because of that fact that you're all working together in that same vein. So that's what it means to me.
I see. Yeah. I do think that that's the case, but it was a bit different. I mean, you see that, for example, like if you wonder why it is that, for example, in the UK, people talk a lot about McAllister, often referred to as like the strictest school in the galaxy or whatever it's called. And on the other hand, you've got schools like, XP or, like School 21 who are doing really well with it, going in a very different direction. But in each case, they were free schools. So they started in year 7 and they were able to attract like-minded teachers. So they had that collective efficacy from the outset. I think in our case, it was a bit different because we definitely had that collective teacher efficacy within the learning skills curriculum, within the taught course. But we like at first, at least, we didn't have that much impact on what was happening throughout the organization as a whole. And the primary outcome of my PhD was how well are these kids doing in maths and English and geography and art and PE and so on. And so that's something that definitely built up more over time. And, by the 3rd or 4th year, it had sort of become a whole school approach to teaching and learning. But that's something that if I knew 10 years ago what I know now about effective implementation, we would have done a whole lot of a better job of that. And I'm sure that the results that we had would have been even more impressive than they were.
Mm. Brilliant. Thank you so much for your response there, James. I'm mindful Ollie's chomping at the bit to say something, so I'll just pass it over to you, Ollie.
Well, I wanted to bring Kate in on the next question, actually, just mindful of time that we're at 1:45 and we've still got a few more questions to go. The book's packed full of strategies. A lot of what James has just been talking about in terms of metacognition with students, self-regulation, collaboration. How do you see this as being applicable to using technology, especially given our current situation with many schools around the world supporting remote teaching and learning? Do you have any suggestions as to what a good one looks like in these circumstances?
Well, I think before lockdown, I would have been adamant that in person everything was better. Like I would have bet my house on it. But now I've had to live through doing a lot of things online that I would much rather have done in person. If you set up your online space with the same care as you would set up your in-person space, and you lay your ground rules down, and you make people feel safe and that they can be their whole selves with you while they're learning, then you can still do a lot of this stuff online well. You can still support people with self-regulated learning, even though you're not next to them. It isn't as good, but it's nowhere near as bad as I would have bet it was going to be until I had done it. So I think you just need to take a little bit more time and care in the preparation than you would have done when you're in person. I think if you're in an in-person space and you can pick up the vibe of what's happening, right, through your body more physically, you can tell what's happening for your learners. So I think if you take the time to set up your space and you make sure that you are looking for that, so you lay down the ground rules of how you want people to communicate together, you can still connect using ICT in a way. You can still collaborate effectively. It's about making sure that you have those channels for communication really wide open, and that people are able to be honest with what's working for them and what isn't, and that they will know that you will respond to that. I think the relationship in learning is always important, and knowing that someone is going to respond to you when you express that you have a need, then that's the important thing. Whether that's happening in person or online, it doesn't matter so much, as long as I think the important thing is that we are able to respond as necessary to what people need in order to be able to learn effectively.
You're on mute, Mark. That's number 2. Bingo.
Thank you, Ollie. That really resonates with me as well, Kate. I mean, like all the things we're sort of talking about today and sharing about today, it's about creating those conditions for success, I guess, isn't it? And so, whether it's an online space and you talked about the amount of care and time and attention you'd spend in doing it, sort of in person, sort of setup. It's just as important, and we've seen that massively. I mean, you've shared, Ollie, yourself, haven't you, plenty about how important it's been for you to get your Teams rooms set up, and how breakout rooms have been really helpful to move learning forward when that functionality became available and things. So yeah, that massively resonates with me, Kate. Thank you. James, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, just quickly on that. It seems to me that the biggest challenge that many schools face currently is in secondary, where the kids have all got their cameras and mics off all the time, and the teacher's just talking into the void. And individually, when my son's school is like this, individually, the kids want to ask questions. They want to say, "Oh, can you go over that again, miss?" Or "I didn't get that," or whatever. But they don't want to be the kid who asks the question, and so they keep their head below the parapet. So each of the kids wants to ask questions and be more interactive. The teacher would dearly love for that to happen, but it just doesn't happen. It's like a Mexican standoff. And so, like Kate said, to establish ground rules, to figure out a way around that, and it's got to be through consensus and agreement, and start small. And we're going to say, right, we're going to just turn our cameras on for 5 minutes and see how that goes. And we're going to have these ground rules, and the kids will love it. They want to be coaxed out of that Mexican standoff situation. And just very briefly, if people want to find out about how to set up ground rules, if you go to the University of Cambridge Thinking Together site, that's about talk rules. They refer to it as ground rules for exploratory talk, but you can apply that just as easily to the online environment. And I really recommend that teachers do that.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, James. Maybe I can grab the link to that from you at the end of the show, and we can share that with our audience. We've certainly had a question on this as well from somebody in the audience today as well. Being mindful of time, jumping through to one of our final questions for you this time, James. What we liked about Chapter 7 was the emphasis that you put onto sort of mixed methods of research. Can you explain to our viewers why this was important to you, using these mixed methods of research, please?
Yeah, very simply. So mixed methods research, it's like a whole thing where there's a journal of mixed methods research, and it just seems like it's just, I don't understand why there's a need for that, because it just seems so obvious that if you just use one method, like if you only look at progress data, say, then, you know, there's limitations to that. You don't know, you can't establish causality just because you did X and Y happened. You can't establish that X caused Y. And so for us, we need to collect multiple types of data over a period of time, so that and each of those different methods of data collection, whether it's surveys or interviews or some sort of psychometric questionnaires or observations or looking in the kids' books, each of those like gives you a different lens. It's like that thing where different people are, you know, touching a different part of the elephant. You get to see a much more rich picture when you collect multiple methods of data. And as a corollary to that, this whole conversation that's happening in this country at the moment around rethinking assessment, I think that that's a really nice idea that we can think of, instead of just having one bottleneck of the GCSE through which all students must pass and 1/3 must fail by design, which is ridiculous and unethical if you think about it. We've created this failure machine. But we could think of the way that we assess children in the same way as a mixed methods research project. And we're like, okay, so how good are they at speaking and listening? How good are they at getting on with other people? How good are they when they've got the internet? How good are they when they haven't got the internet? So that you get this much richer picture of what that kid is capable of. So we can apply that same thinking of mixed methods education research to how we assess and evaluate and celebrate the learning of kids.
Well, I mean, that's the holy grail, isn't it? I mean, in terms of, you know, the thinking around qualifications and how we move forwards, whether or not that translates into the conversations that are happening through all the various sort of departments of for education bodies and whatnot at the moment. Well, it'd be lovely to see that change. Certainly, you know, something which has been talked about for a long, long time, isn't it?
Yeah, there is some momentum behind this at the moment. I think that COVID has given lots of people inside the system and outside the system real pause for thought, and they're like, hang on, do we want to go back to this mad system that we had before, or is this an opportunity to do something different? And if people aren't aware of this, wherever you are in the world, if you go to rethinkingassessment.com, you can sign up. I'm not on commission here. It's just a free thing. You sign up, fill out the survey and get involved in that conversation. They're going to publish a couple of reports later this year. And I think that there's quite a lot of momentum. There are exam boards involved in it. There's psychologists, child psychologists. This is not just the same old voices banging the same old drum. This really feels like a coalition of willing and able people. So let's see where it goes.
That's really interesting. I'm on the board with an organisation called the Foundation for Educational Development, alongside the likes of Dame Alison Peacock, Estelle Morris, just sort of some people who will sort of be on your wavelength. But there's loads and loads of us. It's the 150th year of state education here in the UK, and we feel it gives us a real opportunity to start thinking about how we can do things differently. And I think you're right. There's so many people saying that, you know, enough's enough, and now is the time for us to actually be starting to think about things a little bit differently. Thank you to you, James, for sharing that link to what you were sharing before. I popped it into the chat. I'm just going to drop this in here. So there's the link that James shared about how you can go about setting up learning spaces and all of that. We've got a lovely comment from Alex as well. Thank you, Alex, for joining us. Thanks to all of us. Great discussions and very interesting questions. We are getting towards the end of our show now. Thank you. Is that a friendly face to you both with Alex, is it?
Yes, it is.
That's us waving at Alex. Hi, Alex.
Brilliant stuff. It's always nice to know you've got a friendly face watching when you're on these sort of things. So thank you for joining us as well, Alex. I really appreciate that. Ollie, do you want to go for the penultimate question with our guests? With your mic on.
3. We've got 2 questions that we always ask our guests. I'll open the floor with this one then first. What's your favourite EdTech tool? We'll go to Kate first, please.
Gosh, what's my favourite EdTech tool?
Yes.
I can't answer that question. I don't know. Go to James. I'm going to think about it and see if I can come up with a decent answer. Sorry.
It's okay.
I think that Kate will agree with my answer. So I'm a recent convert to Mighty Networks that actually Kate introduced me through. If people aren't familiar with Mighty Networks, it's sort of like there's a free version or you can have paid versions, and it sort of works like a sort of a mini Facebook page for special interest groups, except that you can see everything that everyone's posted and there are no adverts. And it doesn't accidentally break democracy in the way that Facebook seems to have done. So Mighty Networks, and if we can segue in a little plug here, the Rethinking Education Mighty Network I set up a month ago, and it's this global group of people, mainly parents, interestingly, who really want to open up a conversation around how we can do things differently. And it's sort of grown out of a podcast. I recently set up the Rethinking Education podcast, and it's sort of a little community that's grown up around that. So come along and join the Rethinking Education collective if you want to get involved in that. But Mighty Networks is a wonderful tool, and I suspect that Kate will agree. She's nodding.
I agree, actually. I suggested to you today. Yes, it's a space where you can nerd out with other people about things that you're really passionate about, and it's a like, as you probably picked up, I'm quite big on safe spaces, right? And people being able to feel like they can fully contribute all of themselves to something that they care about. And whether that's learning or a hobby, it doesn't really matter. And so Mighty Networks is somewhere that you can go and you can meet like-minded people who are asking similar questions, and it's really supportive, and you learn loads, and there's no adverts, as James said, and it's free. And so if you go to Mighty Networks, you can just search for anything you're interested in learning more about, or that you are super learned about that you want to share with others. So yeah, Mighty Networks.
That sounds like a great sort of level playing field for conversation and professional learning. So it's definitely something and the thing I love mostly is something new to me. I so rarely find something which is new to me. So I mean, I'm going to be all over this like a rash. So thank you for sharing that, both of you. Ollie, do you want to do the last question as well?
Yeah, last question is, could you just share a book with us? Does not have to be educational. Could be anything that's had the biggest influence on you as an educator and a person.
So I'm good. Can I choose a book that's not out yet? There's a book that's coming out in the spring by Guy Claxton, which is absolutely sensational. It's called the Future of Teaching and the Myths That Hold It Back. And to come back to the start of the conversation, it's sort of about all this stuff around knowledge-rich curriculums and direct instruction and cognitive load theory and stuff. And Guy Claxton is a very experienced and learned cognitive scientist. He knows his stuff, and he just has a massive problem with the way in which we've got this very simplified model of the mind that's being repeated and reiterated through all of these books about you've got a working memory in a box, and then you got an arrow, and then it goes long-term memory. And he's like, this was thrown out by cognitive scientists 20 years ago. So he just drives a coach and horses through all this sort of very oversimplified ideas of what the people refer to as the cognitive architecture of the mind, as though it's like stable, like a building is architectured. So his book is sensational. Keep an eye out for that. It's out in April.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that one.
I would So for me, one of the books that's had the biggest impact on me in the last few years is called When the Body Says No by Dr. Gabor Mate. And I was fortunate enough, I went to Glasgow a couple of years ago to the ACE Aware Nation conference. So everyone was talking about ACEs and what all of the different systems could do to work together to support human beings all the way through their life, through social care, through education. And he spoke for hours. and I was just in raptures. And I read his book, When There's No, and it has completely changed my life. It's changed the way that I eat. It's changed the way that I talk to myself. It's changed the way that I talk to other people. It's changed the way that I make decisions. And I wish that I had read it when I started teaching. I wish I had known how to protect myself from burnout, how to protect the people around me from burnout, how to protect the children that I taught from developing habits that would lead them to burnout. It's a real game changer. If you are in any kind of caring profession, then I cannot recommend it highly enough.
Sorry, I thought you were going to jump in on the end there, Ollie. Thank you so much for sharing that, Kate. I missed it. The book sounds absolutely, just like the one thing that every, NQT, ICT needs to read, but I didn't quite catch the name of it. Could you share that again for us, please?
Yeah, it's called When the Body Says No. It teaches us how to listen to how our body is.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing that, Kate, and thank you to both of you for all of your responses during the course of the show this evening. It's been absolutely fantastic to have a little bit of your time to unpick and gather some of your ideas around all of this. If you're looking to find out more about Kate and James's book, then just to refresh your memories, if you've forgotten from 50 minutes ago, it's called Fear is the Mind Killer. It's released on John Catt. It's available from Amazon, although I did spot recently a bit of a discount on by buying it directly from John Catt. But wherever you get it from, I know you'll find it a really interesting read, and there are lots of strategies and ideas and things that you can take away to help support what you're doing in the classroom, regardless of you being primary, secondary, FE. There's lots of transferable ideas in there in whatever your setting is. Well, that leads me to say really is, again, a massive thank you to Kate McAllister and to Dr. James Mannion for joining us this evening. And before we shoot off, though, Ollie, do you want to share about next week's show?
Absolutely. Next week, we're going to look at modelling in physics in a hybrid approach. We're joined by Matt Clark, Head of Science, British School of Muscat. Those of you long-time supporters of the show will remember Matt was on, I think, our third ever show, but also presented at the conference back in the middle of October, or end of October, start of November. So we welcome Matt back onto the show to talk a little bit about his approach to modelling and a hybrid approach. So really looking forward to that, plus one other special guest, but we will wait to release that in the week.
Well, thanks for sharing with me. That'd be news to me with that special guest as well, Ollie. And I'm assuming, actually, modelling is modelling, isn't it? And so whilst there'll be some very subject-specific things for physics, actually there'll still be takeaways, I'm sure. He gave some great examples of modelling in his presentation about how he introduces things in PowerPoint, didn't he? If I remember rightly. But going back to the Education Endowment Foundation's report from March 2019, and they talk about how technology can be used to improve explanations of modelling, don't they? And so I'm sure there'll be lots of cross-curricular applicable approaches in that session with maths, albeit not specific to physics. But look, it's time for us to go. Thank you all again for taking the time to join us. We'll see you all same time, same place next week. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button, whichever side it is. I always get the wrong side. But thank you very much again for everything. And please enjoy your half-term break if and when it comes. For the meantime, be safe, look after yourselves, and we'll see you next time. Thanks a lot. Cheers.
Thank you.